Scroll sawing letters can be intimidating, especially when they're detailed and full of tight turns. In this video, I'll show you how I cut this layered welcome sign step by step, including a simple trick that makes sharp direction changes easy and clean, even if you're a beginner. Got another Steve grit pattern for you today. This is it. It's a welcome sign. Two woods contrasting. I'm going to use oak and walnut. He suggests either quarter or half-inch material. I'm going to use half-inch. I will give a link in the description. I'm starting with the most difficult part of the project, the letters spelling out welcome. I used scroll saw tape to attach the pattern to the wood, and I'm switching to a number 5 Pegas Modified Geometry blade. This will easily handle half-inch red oak and be small enough to capture the details and the turns. This is not a difficult pattern, and a beginner should be able to handle it if they follow my tips and tricks. These letters will be easier to cut than many because of the font used in the design. Most fonts use sharp 90-degree turns at the corners where the lines change from horizontal to vertical. This design has small oval shapes at the top corners and curved lines at most other intersections. I drilled my pilot hole near the top of the letter W and started cutting down one of the angled lines. This line switches direction with a sharp point at the tip of an acute angle. The easiest way to make a turn like this is to go past the intersection and cut into the waist area. There I made a 180-degree turn by spinning the workpiece with the blade still running. Then I started cutting again and only had to make a slight shift to align the blade with the new cutting direction. The next two turns were rounded corners, so I just kept following the cut line. This brought me to another sharp point at an acute angle turn, and I made that in the same manner as the first one. There were several easy curved corners and then one of those difficult corners. After that, there are two rounded corners, and the letter W was completed by adding the two oval shapes on either side of the top. If you've watched many of my previous videos, you may remember that when I cut letters, I tend to cut on the inside of rather than right on the lines. I'm not following that practice here because these are large letters and there's plenty of space between them, so there's no danger of the letters running into one another. The only place I will likely make an exception is on the letter O because I don't want to weaken the tabs holding the two sides together. I drilled larger than usual pilot holes on this project because I had a 1/8 inch bit in the drill press for another project. These letters are large enough that the hole fits within the cut lines, so I didn't bother switching out the drill bit. The letter E didn't present any cutting challenges. I started cutting near the pilot hole and then took my time following the line, letting the blade do the work. I skipped showing me cutting the L and the C because there was nothing new to show there. These are straightforward, follow the line, let the blade do the work cuts. They merely need a steady hand and a bit of patience, the most basic skills you need to be successful at scroll sawing. The letter O, of course, needs to be cut in two parts to prevent it from becoming just a large oval rather than a letter of the alphabet. This is one of those areas where you have to be extremely careful when cutting if the letter is small. Fortunately, this is a large letter, so even a beginner should be able to cut it without problems. I'm still going to be cautious and cut on the inside of the lines at the top and bottom of the O. Even though this piece will later be glued to a backer, I don't want to risk the center breaking during handling. The M is essentially an upside-down W, or the other way around if you prefer. Unlike some fonts with buku 90-degree turns, most corners on this letter are rounded. Like several of the other letters, the top sides have little ovals at the corners. Since there are those sharp turns on the inside of the letter, I'll describe how I do them once again. This is a useful technique to have in your bag of tricks. Rather than trying to make a very difficult turn for the sharp angles, I cut slightly past the turning point, a bit into the waist area. There I can easily pivot the workpiece 180 degrees and head to the new cutting direction in the saw blade curve already created. When I arrive at the turning point, the directional change is slight and very easy to make. I use this same technique on each of the sharp, pointed direction changes. I can now move on to the exterior cut for this layer. I chose to start in the middle of the oval's top because it was close to the board's edge. I'll always start at a corner if there is one, but that option was obviously unavailable here. If you have to start on a curve, I recommend starting at the flattest part of the curve, preferably at a spot you can easily reach later. I say this because there will almost always be a rough spot or bump where the cut started and stopped. You'll need to reach this spot with sandpaper or a file later to smooth it out. I ran my finger over that spot on this piece, and the bump was very small, so I could quickly and easily smooth it out with 120 grit sandpaper. I cut the front layer from red oak, and now I'll cut the backer from walnut to provide a nice contrast. There are 4 interior cuts for this layer, and I drilled the pilot holes at the same time as I did for those of the top layer. I drilled the pilot holes near the most difficult part of the cut because that's where I wanted to start. I cut from the pilot hole to the point of the acute angle formed by the change in cutting direction. From there, I backed the blade to the pilot hole, pivoted the workpiece 180 degrees, and then backed the blade through the curve I had just created until I reached the turning point again. This may seem like a lot of movement that hasn't accomplished anything, but it has. The blade is now positioned where only a small movement of the workpiece will be necessary to start this interior cut. The first part of this piece is long, slightly curved, and very easy to follow. Then the line turns into a gentle radius, followed by a relatively tight turn and another easy radius that leads to a point and a 90-degree turn. I make interior 90-degree turns by cutting to the intersections point where the 2 lines forming the angle meet. I stop the forward motion of the workpiece, allow the blade to continue moving in the newly created curve, and pivot the workpiece 90 degrees. Once the blade is aligned for the next cutting direction, I resume applying pressure to the workpiece and resume cutting. There's a very short straight line and another 90-degree corner. I cut this in the same manner as the previous one. The other 3 interior cuts are just like the first, except that they're inverted or mirror images of the one just completed, so I didn't show myself cutting them. The external cut isn't particularly difficult, but it will require some patience and attention to detail. I started cutting at the top of the pattern. Since the top and bottom are mirror images of each other, it doesn't matter which you call the top and which you call the bottom. The pattern is too wide to fit on one 8.5 by 11 sheet of paper, so I had to carefully attach the 2 pages it printed on by matching up the dotted lines and arrows on each page. The decoration in the middle of the top and the bottom comes to a point, so it's a good starting place for that reason, and the fact that this is close to the edge of the material gives it another advantage as a starting point. A short distance after cutting down the right side of the finial at the top of the backer, I came to a sharp turn. I made it in essentially the same manner as a 90-degree turn. I cut to the intersection, used the curve plus maybe a tiny bit of waste area to pivot the workpiece with the blade running, then started cutting again once the blade was aligned with the new cutting direction. Following the line leads to a loop, a curve, and then a nearly 90-degree turn. I used my normal procedure. I made that turn, cut the short straight line, and then made the next sharp turn. The next part of the external cut requires excellent eye-hand coordination, as the cut line continually flows around curves and even flows around 180-degree direction changes. I was able to make these cuts with the blade running at full speed, but if you're new to scroll sawing, you may need to slow the saw down to a more comfortable speed. The next little detail is a circular object with very tight turns at either side where it attaches to the backer's edge. I made these turns by cutting to the point where the line changes direction, easing up pressure on the blade, pivoting the workpiece, and then starting to cut again. The 2 cuts at either side of the circle could also be made by cutting to the corner, backing up a short distance into the curve, pivoting the workpiece 180 degrees, and then backing to the turning point. Either technique works, so it's a matter of choosing the one that's most comfortable for you. Once I reached the next turning point, it was a matter of applying the techniques already described to make the 2 90-degree turns close together. That was followed by an easy, smooth-flowing curve that ended at a familiar-looking shape with an interior cut. From here on, every cut is one that's been made before on this project, except it may be flipped upside down or a mirror image of one already cut. Either way, there's nothing new to show, as I've already imparted every tip or trick you'll need to know how to make this large external cut for the backer. If only I could cut at 10 times my normal speed, I could complete projects so quickly my productivity would be incredible. I did a bit of sanding to touch up the two layers, and I rounded over the top edge of the welcome layer to soften it to the touch. I'm using a medium-sized glue bottle to apply tight bond white glue to the back of the top layer. This is my favorite glue because it has a reasonable working time, it dries clear, and it cleans up with water. I'm using an acid brush to spread the glue, ensuring it gets between the letters and all the way to the edge of the oval. With the top layer centered, it was time to add clamps. I added spring clamps to each end of the oval, but at first I wasn't sure they'd have the depth to be used elsewhere. I tried one, found it was usable, and then grabbed 3 more spring clamps from the storage rack over the counter behind my workbench. I let the glue dry overnight and take this to the finishing room in the morning. I plan on using several coats of Minwax spray polyurethane. This is one of those projects that looks complicated but really isn't once you know how to approach the cuts. If you found these tips helpful, give the video a thumbs up. It helps the channel more than you might think. I've linked the Steve Goodman pattern in the description. If you enjoy scroll saw projects like this one, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future builds. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next project.